Peter chapter 2 and verse 19, where Peter is warning the Christians he's writing to that, hey, there are going to be false teachers that come along, and they're going to try to make God seem like someone who is a slaver, and he's not. He says they've promised them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption, since people are enslaved to whatever defeats them. And so he's saying, hey, while they're trying to make God seem like someone who enslaves people, they're actually enslaved to the sins of this world and their own desires. But anyway, that's one of the places I saw this here. One of the things I really want us to do when looking at Genesis and looking at Exodus is ask the question and see, who is God? And what does this text tell us about God so we better understand him? Because it's very easy for us to, not very easy, but we are definitely going to run into people who are going to try to make God seem like someone that he's not. So it's important that we know who he actually is. And that's one of the aspects I see about him in this text. Anything else that people are seeing in verses 1 through 10? Go ahead, Ms. Christine, and then Kaylee.
It was interesting and beautiful to see that the servant and Pharaoh's daughter, they didn't see a Hebrew child and go, we need to kill it, we need to get rid of it. They saw that baby, and I think that every woman in this room, but every woman also around the world, when you see a baby, you're like, I want to care for this baby. You don't care whose baby it is. If it's crying, you're like, let me help this child. Unless you're sick in the mind, I think it's wonderful that God instills that in us, that we want to care for a baby regardless of whose baby it belongs to.
Right. I think it was I'm trying to find the text. Last week we looked briefly, I believe, at Acts 7. In terms of Stephen speaking to some Jews, and he's comparing, again, Jesus to Moses. And I'm trying to see if I can find it, but it's either that passage or another one in the New Testament retells the story of Moses, and it describes God viewing Moses as a beautiful child. So it's interesting to see that when Pharaoh's daughter looks at Moses and has pity on him, and when his mother looks at him, we're told the reason that she hides him is because she says this child is beautiful. They're seeing the child the way that God sees the child, which is a really awesome connection to make. And it's from seeing the child in that way that God's will is done, that life is brought about, that they go against the commands of Pharaoh. So yeah, it is a refreshing thing to see people see children this way in this text. Go ahead, Kaylee?
Along those same lines, it's all the things that we're not told is what stands out to me. Like, how hard was this for Pharaoh's daughter to hide this from him? Or did she not hide it? Like, did he know she adopted a Hebrew baby?
Yeah.
Was she married and passed it off as, like, this is my own child, and he didn't question it? Or, like, how brave was this for her to be like, I'm adopting a Hebrew child, but none of that is in here. So it's like, wait, how did she get away with this when there was this edict that all Hebrew boys be killed? You know, so
Yeah.
what stands out is the things that aren't in the text.
Exactly.
I wish I knew more.
Yeah. First off, happy Mother's Day to all the mothers in the room and any grandmothers in the room. It's sticking out in this text, right? For one thing, we see that Moses is saved through adoption. That's one thing I want to make a connection about in terms of, okay, how is Moses like Jesus? Moses is saved through being included in Pharaoh's family, right? But Jesus comes along, he's a leader like Moses, and on the other hand, he saves us through including us in his family. Again, it's salvation happening through a type of adoption going on here. But yes, right, Pharaoh's daughter adopting Moses and taking on this mother role to him, like, saves him. And what would that have looked like in the context of that royalty? Did she hide it from Pharaoh, or did she have that motherly confidence and say, hey, I'm taking care of this child, there's nothing you're going to do about it? And Pharaoh's like, all right, like, I guess she's got a point, that strong motherly will. But either way, we see God working in mysterious ways and interesting ways here, and bringing, again, about life. Because when you take a step back and look at the entire picture, you see one side that is pushing for death and another side that is heavily pushing for life. All right, that's all I had for this section. Is there any other questions or comments that people have? Go ahead, Greg.
If the Pharaoh is Ramses II, and if the daughter is Hatshepsut, as is assumed by a lot of scholars, Ramses had multiple children by multiple wives, and those children had multiple children. So it's estimated that Moses could have been one of 120 grandchildren. That right there could have given him some cover.
Right.
Now, we know from the text, both in Exodus and then also what the Hebrew writer says, that Moses himself excelled in Pharaoh's household. But, I mean, it's very reasonable and plausible that he could have been there, grown up, and Pharaoh not have noticed, maybe in the way that we assume he just immediately would have.
Right. Look at David, look at Solomon. Apparently it was a common thing that kings had a lot of partners, but also a lot of children. It would make sense that Moses may have been able to blend in that way. But it also reminds me just again of how Moses, the process of how Moses is dealt with reminds me a lot of how Joseph is dealt with. Again, they kind of move into that leadership position in Egypt, and God uses that person to save and help a lot of other people. Go ahead, Mr. Steve.
Just an interesting fact. Moses was not named by his mother, and neither was Jesus.
Yeah.
Kind of, I mean, today we wouldn't think of that. I mean, people go crazy thinking about a name for their new child. You know?
Right.
They didn't have to worry about that.
Yeah. Now, that's a comparison I didn't realize. I appreciate that. Again, always looking for different ways that you can compare Moses to Jesus to tell us more about Jesus. And that is an interesting one, right? That their names are given from someone of royalty, or from someone higher up, right? For Moses, it's the Egyptian queen, right? Pharaoh's daughter. And then for Jesus, it's God. It's an angel that comes and tells him. So thank you for pointing that out. But as we're going to continue on in the text, but as we're always looking through this text and through others, we should be looking and asking, what does this tell us about God? So I just want to reiterate again, what I saw from the first 10 verses is that, one, God works in weird and mysterious ways, and it tends to be in ways that nobody expects. So even in the complexity of working through Pharaoh's household, or being found or guided through a river possibly, and Pharaoh's daughter coming across that way, God is doing great things in ways that we probably wouldn't predict. So we shouldn't be surprised when God does amazing things in our life in weird ways, or we probably shouldn't try to predict every way that God is going to do great things in our life. On the other hand, I just saw a whole lot of freedom here, from how God brings these wages to Moses' mother, to some of the other things that we'll see in Exodus, like the Israelites being freed from Egypt, or just the year of Jubilee that comes along later when teaching Israel how to be a nation. There are a lot of aspects or different ways that we see God bringing freedom to people. And I think that's something we should keep in mind. That's an aspect of God that I think people try to misconstrue. So let's look at this next section here. Let's look at verses 11 through 15. Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 15 says this. Years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and he saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you attacking your neighbor?" The Hebrew said, "Who made you a commander and judge over us?" The man replied, "Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Okay, what's sticking out to us in the text? There's a lot of interesting stuff here. Go ahead, Mr. Renee.
Well, it says that he went out to his people. Did he know that they were his people?
I would imagine yes.
It kind of sounds like it. So he wasn't raised to think or believe that he was Egyptian if he knew that those were his people.
Exactly. So when I read this text, I wrote down in my notes, he remembered the words at the door. Right? When you're leaving your house, your parents will pull you aside and they always say, like, remember who you are, remember who you belong to. Not only is it a blessing in terms of Moses getting to be with his family and his mother being paid for what she does, but that time was important in terms of him being raised with them and then him being handed over to Pharaoh's daughter, because obviously his family either with his family or somehow at some point, he was educated about who he really was, that he was a Hebrew. And on that note, it could have been his family. It could not have been, in the sense that we've read previously in Genesis that Egypt was very racist, right, towards the Hebrews specifically. Joseph rose up in power in this nation, and despite how powerful he was, like the second most powerful man in Egypt, the Egyptians were still considered it detestable to eat with him. They refused to eat with him. In the same sense, when Joseph's family shows up, they hide what their true vocation is, because the Egyptians found shepherding detestable as well. So you have these shepherding Hebrews. It's a double whammy for the Egyptians in terms of, we find these people detestable. So at the same time, the Egyptians may have always made that separation with Moses as well, to say, hey, you're Pharaoh's son, or Pharaoh's daughter's son, but you're still a Hebrew, and we're not going to forget that. Go ahead, Mr. Steen.
I mean, it's kind of an assumption, but his mom did care for him at nursing. I'm sure she kind of guided him. If it's not a big leap to think, maybe she kind of raised him as well. Like, since you're already cared for him and you're looking out for him, and there's 130 other kids, we could use the help. And
right.
you know, like she probably was guiding him and letting him know, like, his people.
Right.
But in a way, I mean, how hard would it be as a mom to not say, you're my child?
Right.
You know, that would be.
Yeah, I always made that assumption, or had that understanding in terms of him being raised, that his mother was making sure that he knew who he was. Did I see a comment over here in this section?
I had the same comment.
Okay.
That she could have also have been a nanny,
Yeah.
you know, even after nursing him.
Yeah.
It's like, let's keep her on. She's really good with this one.
We got 130.
All right, what do we think about what Moses does here? We see that he goes, and I think a part of it is not only, okay, maybe it was the way that the Egyptians treated him, maybe it was his mother teaching him and raising him about who he is or who he's supposed to be. We're told in verse 11, which I noticed now, didn't notice in my previous readings, that he was going out there, he was observing the thing that was happening, right? So he's looking and he's recognizing, okay, my people, not only am I Israelite, but these people are being mistreated. He's seeing that and noticing that. What do we think about what Moses does here, right? He sees that his people are being oppressed. He kills a man, right, in terms of doing this. Go ahead, Mr. Mike.
I was wondering if it was intentional that he killed him, or whether he was just trying to stop the conflict and he accidentally, hit his head on a rock, or we don't know. But I'm saying, or was he not going to correct the situation, have that Egyptian go back and tell, hey, this guy got in the way of me disciplining a Hebrew?
I think he did it on purpose. I think it was intentional, because what we're told in verse 12 is that he does one of these before when he sees what's going on, he does the shoulder check, and then he goes and he kills this person. And so I'd say based off of verse 12, it made me believe that what he's doing was intentional, because it makes it sound as though if somebody else was around to see what was going on, he wouldn't have done this. And plus, I'm sure there are several other times where Israelite was being treated this way. And if there are probably other times that Israelite was being struck by an Egyptian. I mean, we're not told about another time about Moses killing him. But anyway, verse 12 makes it sound as though it's intentional, that if somebody was around, Moses may have not have done this. But also, I think he knows, again, also how Pharaoh would respond to this, because he hides the body, and as soon as Pharaoh does hear what happens, he loses his mind about it. I've always considered, the more I read the text, sometimes I wonder if Moses has anger issues. That sometimes he'll see things, seriously, he'll see things and he'll kind of just lash out and get like really angry. We see that he sees what's happening to the Israelite here. He lashes out and he kills this man. We see that later on in the text, God tells him to speak to a rock. He strikes it. We see that he goes and gets the tablets on Mount Sinai. He comes down. He sees that Israel is not being the nation it's supposed to be. And what does he do? He throws those tablets down. Yeah, there's this understanding that the covenant has been broken as soon as we've made it, but there's also this understanding, it's like Moses, like, those are tablets that God wrote on himself. Like, the other thing I wrote down, though, is in that sense, I read the text and I say maybe Moses had anger issues, but also he had a lot to deal with in the first place. So maybe that was just the expected kind of response to dealing with, people like the Israelites. But anyway, just that's something that stuck out to me in this text in terms of what Moses is doing and what he's going through. Go ahead, Mr. Murray.
Just to follow. later on when he sees the two Hebrews fighting, they say, what, are you going to kill one of us?
Right.
Rather than saying, hey, thank you for saving this man from the Egyptians, they're almost berating him for what he did.
Yeah. Yeah. So this took my mind to what we've been seeing in Genesis, that aspect of family, but Israel and the Jews not being as considerate of each other as they should be in the first place. I'm not surprised that, one, the same Jew who says that to him is one who is, already doing his brother wrong, is what we're told. The one in the wrong is the one that said this to Moses. And it's ironic. In verse 14, he says, who made you the commander and judge over us? Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? It's ironic for him to say that because that's exactly what happened, right? God makes Moses a commander and judge over these people, a leader to these people. So it hasn't happened yet, but eventually, who made you commander over us? God did. But at the same time, it takes my mind back to what we briefly read last week in Acts 7, the context of that, and again, making sure we're making the connections to Jesus. The context of that is Stephen talking to the Jews, reminding them that they've always been a rebellious people and always been a people who rejected leaders that were sent to them. In the same way they rejected Jesus, they rejected Moses first. And you see that exact thing here. God sent you a great leader, and your first response is to act out and rebel against him. And we see that as early as here. What Moses is dealing with here, he's going to be dealing with for the rest of the Old Testament. Okay. Why does Moses flee Egypt? Why are we told he flees after this occasion?
Pharaoh wanted to kill him.
Right. I had the impression as a child that this statement that the Hebrew says to him is what made him leave, and that's not the case. So just making that clarification, but I do still think it probably did impact him for his own people. Obviously, he's affected by how his people are being treated. I do still feel like that statement does have an impact on him. Later on, when God comes to him and tells him, you're going to be a leader over the Israelites, he says, ha, no, I'm not. Right? And he's like, I'm not a great leader, despite all the things that he's learned in Pharaoh's household. So maybe, who knows, maybe this statement did impact him later on. But I had the impression that the kind of shock of what this Hebrew was saying to him made him leave as a kid. But instead, it really seems like him fearing his life in terms of killing that Egyptian is what makes him flee. Do you have another comment?
Well, I was going to say, in mine, both in the NIV and the ESV, it says that when Moses was afraid after the Israelites said, are you going to kill me? And kill the Egyptian.
Right.
It says, as if Moses was thinking, surely this thing is known. Obviously, somebody saw him.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it could have been what the guy said to him did make him flee because he knew
He knew, right.
Pharaoh was going to seek out to kill him.
He said word's getting around, like he has
Yeah,
to.
word spread.
He has to go. Did I see another comment over here? Go ahead, Ms. Gail.
The faith chapter of Hebrews, it says, by faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God, rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time.
Yes. Yeah, that.
He chose to go out there. He chose to, but I think, should not think as I think, because the Bible tells me all. But, possibility that he was ridiculed for being Pharaoh's daughter in the Egyptian palace, and then he was ridiculed by his own people for living in Pharaoh's, palace too.
Right.
So it kind of, like he chose to not be Pharaoh's daughter's child.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up, Ms. Gail. That's exactly where I was going, is that in terms of him leaving, he now has two people who have pretty much rejected him. In a way, his people have, but the Egyptians have as well. So he's in a pretty lonely place. But thank you for bringing up Hebrews again. That beautiful aspect that we talked about before is here. It says, by faith, Moses, after he was born, was hidden by his parents for 3 months because they saw the child was beautiful and they didn't fear God's edict. There's that beautiful aspect again. But the Christ connection is here. In verse 26, it says, for he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. So we're told by the Hebrew writer that Moses made the decision that he made, and he had somehow the reproach of Christ in mind as well. That and some kind of hope as well. He was looking forward to some type of reward. But he chose the Israelite people over the comfort of Pharaoh's house and made that decision. And somehow him doing that is a lot like Christ in terms of the reproach that Christ chose as well on our behalf going to the cross. That's amazing. And again, as we look at the text, I always want to ask, how do we see God? What does this tell us about God? I see God's plan and see him definitely at work in terms of what's happening in Moses' life, and all of it pointing to Christ in a meaningful way for us,
We
for
can
sure.
see that now because we have the scriptures in front of us.
Exactly.
But if I was Moses, I don't know if I mean, he may have known something was greater because he probably was told by his birth mother, there's something special about you.
Yeah.
So a possibility he might have known that, but
Yeah, the Hebrew text.
Exodus tells us is afraid. The Hebrews tell us by faith he was not afraid.
Right. Right. That's amazing. All right, let's keep going in the text. We're going to look at now verses 16 to 25. I'm always trying to, as we're looking at these texts, point out the geography of what's going on. We're told that Moses runs from Egypt to Midian after these events that are occurring, and he sits down by a well. And again, I don't know if this sticks out to anybody else. I really find myself being interested in the geography for one of the main reasons being that whenever we hear about someone going and doing something, it tends to be farther than you think, almost always. At least it's always farther than I think. So we're told that when the Israelites are enslaved to Egypt, that they're building these store cities for Pharaoh at Ramses and Pithom, right? Which are, oh man, all right, they're right over here. Up here in Goshen, you see Ramses, you see Pithom there. And then we're told that that Moses runs over to Midian. I assume that Midian would be somewhere on the outskirts of the things that are going on, maybe even somewhere in this wilderness over here. Midian's all the way over here. So Moses runs from here all the way over there. So yeah, man was definitely afraid in terms of what things that were going on with Pharaoh, but he runs a long way. And so when we're thinking about Moses going and spending 40 years over in this area, like he's absolutely changing his life, right? He's really getting out of the way and going a far distance. That really stuck out to me in terms of the things that are going on and where he is. He's in a very unfamiliar place when we read these next couple of verses. So just keep him in mind in terms of him being there in verses 16 to 23. Last week, when we looked at distances again, someone asked me how far these things were, so I tried to make sure I knew this time. I took a ruler and measured it out. It's about 280 miles. He runs like 280 miles away from Egypt, if anybody was wondering. So let's continue on in verses 16 through 25. It says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then some shepherds arrived and drove them away, but Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. And they returned to their father Reuel, and he asked, 'Why have you come back so quickly today?' And they answered, 'An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock.' 'So where is he?' he asked his daughters. 'Why then did you leave the man behind? Invite him to dinner.' So Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. She gave birth to a son, whom he named Gershom, for he said, 'I have been a resident alien in a foreign land.'" Right? So seems that Moses, again, definitely recognizes how far he is from home, even in terms of naming his own son. Anyway, what sticks out to you in this text? Anything weird, anything interesting? Go ahead, Michael.
I oddly thought reading this, what a great pick for a son-in-law, right? A killer who's fled his land.
Yeah. Yeah. Did they even know that at the time, right? Like, maybe Moses left that in the fine print, didn't bring that up to his father-in-law. But it's definitely an interesting pick. Just the right amount of things had to happen for Moses to appear to these people to be the person that he was, right? He definitely shows up as like the rescuer and the hero, right? Like in terms of what he's doing, automatically you imagine the women are like, oh, Moses is so strong, so cool, right? He shows up and he saves all these women. So, yeah, interesting pick, but he shows up and he finds himself a wife in Midian. Who is Reuel? Mr. Mike, do you have a comment before you answer that question? Go ahead.
First of all, it's interesting that these daughters recognize him as an Egyptian.
Yes.
So he's still either dressed that way or looking that way somehow.
Yeah.
And then Dad asked the Egyptian back to his house. I would have thought that was real unusual at that time.
Yeah, so we talked about how he feels like he's kind of rejected by both people at the time. He's a Hebrew, but the Hebrews don't seem to recognize him. And he's an Egyptian, but the Egyptians don't recognize him fully. They're like, this man is a Hebrew. And he shows up in Midian. It's interesting that that's what they clock first. They don't say he's a Hebrew. This man is an Egyptian. But even still, I recognize him as an Egyptian. Yeah, I think it's a big statement that Ruel was still like, hey, we want you in our household. You've done this great thing. Come and eat with us. And that doesn't mean everything to them, for sure. Al, did you have a comment?
No.
Okay. But let's talk about Ruel. Who's Ruel? Go ahead, Miss Sandy.
Jethro, if you go into chapter 3, verse 1, now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law.
Yes.
And him being the priest of the Median.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's the same name. It's two different names for the same person. So when we read about him later on in Exodus or in other places, when we read of Jethro showing up, it's talking about Ruel. It's the same person. People were saying this could either be his last name or maybe a clan name. Either way, this is Moses' father-in-law that we're talking about. Ruel means a friend of God, or friend to God, friend of God. And it's not surprising, considering we've done this study about names of God, that El is in the name. And so the Ru is probably the friend of part that is coming from. But it's interesting that Moses runs all this way. He comes to a new land. He runs into other people who have some kind of connection or familiarity with God. The other thing I wanted to point out was something that we talked about in Genesis. One of the themes I kept bringing up in that book was the concept of how we got here. This book is kind of trying to explain to his audience why people are where they are, why people are who they are. And we see some of that if we backtrack. So in Genesis chapter 25, verses 1 through 4, we're told about Abraham and his wives, right? Abraham had taken another wife. Her name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran and Gashan and Medan and Midian, right? And so they're not through the line of Jacob or of Isaac, but they're still from Abraham. These are relatives to the Israelites, right? And so it's no surprise that they would know God or have some type of connection to God. But in that same way of talking about having a concern for family, Moses would have been distantly related to these people, or these people would have distantly had a blood connection to the Israelites. They're still children of Abraham. Just an interesting thing to keep in mind and point out, and that was one of the purposes of Genesis and why the book of Genesis is important and why we read Genesis. It's still applying while we read Exodus. Okay, what's up with this business at the well? Is there anything sticking out to anybody about the well? Go ahead.
This happened in Genesis, too, with, I believe, Rebecca and Isaac.
Yes.
Or Joseph. He met in this woman and watered the sheep, and then this is the same here.
Yes, yeah. So it's a biblical pattern or trend that people tend to find other people, at least in Genesis or in the Old Testament, at a well. Ms. Christine, do you have a comment on that?
Is this a singles hangout? Do they hang out at the well and women are coming?
That is what I thought. I try to, I joke with people sometimes today in terms of, okay, if you're a single Christian, where are you going to find someone that you're looking for? What is the modern day equivalent of a well? I said maybe it's a coffee shop in terms of that's where people come to like quench their thirst. And I was like, maybe it's just a place where people have their needs met somehow. I thought that this is where the text was going. I don't know if this is just a meta way of looking at it. I said perhaps it's just the concept of trying to find someone around a source of life. So Isaac has his servant sent, or Abraham sends his servant to find Rebekah for Isaac. In the same sense, Jacob goes to the land of his uncle Laban and finds Rachel there when he waters her flock. Jesus in the New Testament, in John 4, meets a Samaritan woman at the well. And it kind of flips the narrative on us, because normally when we read about this, we're like, okay, this is the Christian singles spot. Like, is Jesus about to have some kind of romantic connection with this woman? And he doesn't. On the other hand, he makes this statement of, okay, the water, or the true living water, is now me. That's me. In John chapter 4, I think I have it on the board for us as well. In 14, Jesus said, everyone who drinks from this water will get thirsty again. Whoever drinks from the water that I will give him will never get thirsty again. In fact, the water I will give him will become a well of water springing up in him for eternal life. And so I was like, okay, maybe you can think of it at a coffee shop. Maybe you can think of it as somewhere people are getting their needs met. Or maybe it's deeper in the sense of when Jesus makes this connection to him being a greater and better well of just trying to find someone who's centering their life around that same source of life. You guys are meeting up at this point of living water. But just an interesting thing that I saw in the text, another way that it's pointing to Jesus. Okay, that's our 5-minute time. What is the last thing that, oh, I know exactly the last thing I want to point out here. In the last couple verses, in verse 23, it says, after a long time, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help, let me start over. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of the difficult labor, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. So again, as we're looking through the text, I want to just keep asking the question, what does it tell us about God? And what does it tell us that God is doing specifically? And this one is more direct because over and over again, the writer, the author here keeps saying, God's doing this, and he's doing this, and he's doing this. And it reminds us that God is a worker, right? That he's laboring out in the world as we're doing things. Where we're told that God remembered his covenant with Isaac and with Jacob and with Abraham. We're told that God sees the things that's going on. We're told that God knew what was going on. We're told that God hears what is being said. He hears their groaning. We're told that their cries are ascending up to God. And I thought that was important for us. Craig and I did a personal study together on this recently because I had some questions about it. But I think overall, as a church, as the body of Christ, we can better learn how to lament, how to be sorrowful, and not to take those emotions and shove them away, but learn and understand how to give them over to God. And these are exact things, or the exact answers that you see lamenting people need. In the Psalms, David comes to God, and he's always talking about how he's surrounded by death and how he's surrounded by enemies. He makes these cries out to God. Jeremiah, in the same way, laments to God. And what are the questions they ask? How long, O Lord, do I have to deal with this? Lord, I feel cut off from you. Lord, do you hear my cries? And these are exact answers to this, right? We look at the Israelite people, and we're told that God is hearing the things that they're saying, and that he knows who they are and what they're going through, and he sees them. And he remembers in the sense that we're told that God keeps his promises. He doesn't forget, and he's not forgetting. And so in the same way that it should be a comfort to Israel, and that's a comfort to David and to Jeremiah as well in terms of their lamenting, it should be a comfort to me. If I feel cut off, if I feel abandoned, if I feel like I'm going through a hard time, I can know that my cries to God they're ascending. They're being heard. God sees me. He knows what I'm going through. The last note I'll leave us on is we talked about these names, right, of God that we've been studying together. It took me to Hagar. When Hagar is being oppressed and abused by her master, Sarah and Abraham, God comes to her, and he answers her prayers. He gives her a way out. He gives her an option. And what does she say? In Genesis 16 and verse 11, the angel of the Lord said to her, you have conceived, and you will have a son, and you will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. Right? God hears. That's where Ishmael's name comes from. Then just 2 verses over, in verse 13, it says, so she named the Lord who spoke to her, you are El Roi. For she said, in this place I have actually seen the one who sees me. So in terms of the things that we read in verses 23 through 25, how we see God interacting with Israel, we keep that in mind when reading about the other sorrowful things that people are going through in Scripture, and then we apply it to ourselves. Knowing that as a Christian and being in Christ, when I'm lamenting, when I'm going through a tough time, when I'm in the place of Israel and I feel like I'm being oppressed, being persecuted, when I cry out to God, God hears me. And that should help me keep on keeping on. All right. That's all I have for us this morning. Again, we're going to be in chapters 3 to chapter 7 and verse 13. So make sure you mark that down. Spend a lot of time in that in this week and keep chewing the cud. Prepare next class with questions and comments. We can all edify one another. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, baby.